Hey, what's up, guys? Ken here from the Retro Toy Escapades channel. Thanks for joining me. And if you're new here and you like what you see, do subscribe to the channel so we can keep it going. Hey, so I wanted to start a new series on the channel where I would sort of share with you guys the story of my journey as a toy collector and just talk about some of the moments that defined it and the way my toy collecting decisions and choices on what and how to collect have changed over the years. I hope you like following my throwback thoughts and recollections and keep following. Now, I would say that I've always been a fan of toys and action figures. I grew up in the 1980s during the best era of cartoons and toy merchandising, and there was no way that wasn't going to rub off on me. But I wouldn't say my toy collecting journey started then. It was more of an obsession more than anything else, and the only way that I could get my hands on the toys I wanted as a kid was basically to whine and cry my eyeballs out at the department store and pray that my parents would give in just because they wanted the noise to stop. It turns out a lot of parents back then were made of much sterner stuff, mine included, and I mostly ended up sulking all the way back home, empty handed, of course. Now, what were the toys I really liked as a kid? Basically, if you remember the 1980s, every cartoon that you would be introduced to on TV would have a corresponding toy line. I mean, you would start watching this cartoon and think, hey, this is not bad. And then there would be an advertisement break, and suddenly the commercial for the toy line of the cartoon you just watched would be running, and you would be like, what the hell? There's toys? Well, yeah. So, can I just say also that, I really miss toy commercials in the 1980s. They used to be the standard with every block of Saturday and Sunday morning cartoons. You'd get, impatient waiting for the first half of the cartoon plot to be over just so that you could get to the commercials. And they would always be switching it up every week. You'd sometimes get Masters of the Universe or Thundercats or G.I. Joe. Every batch of ads would be different from week to week. There was just no shortage of toy commercials to get through. These days, when ads run through a cartoon, you'd most probably just get somebody trying to sell milk or chocolate bars. But back then, it was toys. The thing about toy commercials back then was that it was really our window as a kid or as kids, to know what was out there and what was coming. There was no internet or printed toy magazines back then to help you keep track. So these commercials helped to build the need and the desire to have a collecting habit. But as a kid, you had no real source of income. So you were really dependent on the good graces of your parents to part with their hard-earned cash. And so you had to be specific with your hints, your clues, and at times, your screaming tantrums at the mall. Now, when I was growing up, the M.A.S.K. toy line and cartoon series was the one franchise that I had the most attraction and affinity to. M.A.S.K., if you remember, stood for Mobile Armored Strike Command. They swapped the C in command to a K, maybe because it sounded cooler. And also, they had to make the acronym work somehow. So, the M.A.S.K. concept involved vehicles that had hidden combat modes and drivers with special masks or helmets that gave them abilities. It got me hooked. Now, I was obsessed with learning and memorizing all the M.A.S.K. vehicle names, agents, and their abilities. There was a lot going on with this toy line. The vehicles were all different from one to the other, from a Camaro to a Corvette to a pickup truck. They all had secret compartments that would reveal different weapons. No two vehicles would have the same functions. The agents were incredibly diverse. You had people from all nationalities and races. It was possibly the first and most inclusive toy line in the world. You had a Japanese agent, a Frenchman, a Brit, a Native American, even an Indian with a turban. Try and beat that. Now, I only had one M.A.S.K. toy as a kid, but we'll get to that later. Now, I live in Malaysia, where I still do. And as a child, all of us were staying in the southern part of the country in a town called Johor. We were neighbors with Singapore, and this is important because even though the Mask cartoon was launched in 1985, Malaysia wouldn't start playing it on TV until late 1987, if I remember correctly. So back then, we would get a lot of our stuff on TV and in the cinemas much later than when they would come out in the United States. But it wouldn't matter because news travels slowly, and it's usually only when you had friends, traveling overseas, and they would come back and they tell you that, hey, you know what, this show that you followed was actually already in season 10 or something in some other part of the world. And you just think that, hey, that place must be the future. So it also meant that the toys for Mask would only start selling in Malaysia something like 3 years after most of the rest of the world got introduced to them. But Singapore, they had the cartoons and they had the toys fresh in 1985. And if you lived in the southern part of Malaysia, in Johor, your television antennas would be able to pick up the signal for most of the shows played on Singaporean TV stations. And that's how me and my friends got introduced to Mask pretty early. And sometime in 1986, I got my first Mask toy when my late mom agreed to get me one of my choosing for doing well in school. And that would turn out to be the Hurricane, which is a classic 1957 Chevy that would transform into a combat tank. Now, my mom would actually pass on just a few months after that, and I'll always remember this as being the last toy that she ever bought for me. And I still remember her at the department store going, are you sure? Are you sure that this is the one that you want? Are you very sure? Because, she just didn't want me changing my mind after she had paid for it and we were already on our way back home. That would have really pissed her off. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So my obsession with Mask would go on for at least a solid 2 more years and change. Now, there's one thing that happened when I was about 11 years old that I'll never forget. So I was in a pretty bad accident and I woke up in the hospital with not much memory of how it happened, other than the fact that I had a fractured left arm. Now, my dad was there and explaining to me what took place, but I kept thinking that it was a dream. Okay, look, I know that these days 11-year-olds are pretty much like adults. I mean, you have 11-year-old celebrities, singers, artists, YouTube superstars. But back then, being 11 meant that you were just 11 years old. And so it was a pretty traumatic experience. And I remember asking myself if, it was all just a dream. And then trying to get a grip on reality by thinking of my favorite toys and cartoons. And thinking of M.A.S.K. and trying to see if I could still remember the names of all the vehicles and their respective drivers, their functions and their accessories. Hey, true story, guys. True freaking story. Okay, now M.A.S.K. was one of those franchises that had a pretty long shelf life. Unlike a lot of the other 80s toy concepts like Brave Star, Visionaries, Silverhawks, and many others that had a short run, and are remembered mostly by a cult following today, M.A.S.K. actually stuck around for almost 4 years. But as time went on, I knew that the hope of owning all the toys that the commercials and catalogs promised was something that would never materialize, at least not in that time and place. So I started looking for alternatives to feed my interests. Stuff that was easier and cheaper for me to obtain by maybe saving up the money for my allowance. So I tried to get my hands on all the tie-in products like, the stickers, the storybooks, and the comic books. Remember that sticker company, Panini? I think they're still around today, but back then, they put out stickers of just about every pop culture property. And you could get these M.A.S.K stickers and put them up in sequence in a special album, which also had a poster in the middle and lots of special stickers with shiny foil effects and stuff like that. It was fantastic. And then I got into the comics. DC Comics, which also does Superman and Batman and the Justice League, produced two series of M.A.S.K comics, one in 1985 and the other in 1987. These comics told all new stories and were actually aged up a bit. So for the first time, you would see the characters in somewhat more matured situations aimed at a slightly older audience. Now, my interest in the M.A.S.K comic eventually got me looking for comic book spin offs of other pop culture properties at the time. So, two of the absolute best comics during the 1980s that were based on toys were the Transformers and G.I. Joe. These were both published by Marvel, and the stories in these comics took the concept of the toys and characters beyond anything that the cartoon series could suggest. So, as I became drawn to comics as a whole, I slowly started to, I guess, wean off toys as a whole. And then 1989 came about and I started high school. Suddenly, I guess everything started to get serious, and it felt that you kind of needed to just grow up and grow up fast. And I wouldn't start thinking about toys or action figures again until something like 7 years later in 1996. 7 years! Imagine going through 7 years today if you're a toy fan and a collector and not buy a single action figure for 7 whole years. But what brought me back? Well, that is a story for another video. So I hope that you enjoyed listening to the story of my early days as a toy fan. And I would like to hear some of your own stories growing up around toys of the 80s and 90s. And by the way, that thumbnail in the video of me surrounded by boxed M.A.S.K toys, the story on that is that one of the collector friends that I know was about to let go of his entire collection of M.A.S.K toys some years back. Like the entire collection from series 1 to 5. So I heard this and I basically just told him, dude, you've got to let me come over and take a photo with the entire collection. Like before it's gone forever. Yeah, so guys, do like and share, and of course subscribe to the channel. Thanks, and I'll catch you all again real soon.